At work, Stanislav was known as a man of granite. At just 35, he headed a massive construction conglomerate. His day was scheduled down to the minute, and his subordinates caught his every glance, knowing well that Stanislav never tolerated carelessness. He was used to the world bending to his strict, ironclad rules. But the moment he crossed the threshold of his luxurious three-room apartment, those rules, for some reason, ceased to apply. Things used to be different here. To be honest, his marriage to his late wife, Marina, had been rather ordinary, free of wild passion or deep, soul-searching conversations. But Marina was the perfect homemaker. The house always smelled of fresh baking. Everything was in its proper place, and their 3-year-old daughter, Lena, was well cared for and happy. Then, 6 months ago, Marina was gone. Her life was cut short in an instant on a slick winter highway. At first, Stanislav's sister came to the rescue. She traveled from another city, took over the household, and kept her brother from losing his mind in the chaos. But she had a family of her own, and a week ago, she had to leave. Stanislav was left alone. The man who effortlessly managed hundreds of workers on construction sites found himself utterly helpless against an empty kitchen, a mountain of dirty dishes, and the quiet crying of his little girl, who called out for her mother every single night. Chapter 1. A Little Angel and Lonely Evenings. The first week without his sister was an exhausting marathon for Stanislav. His perfect life, where every minute brought in money, had cracked. He learned that the world does not care about a CEO's schedule when he has a 3-year-old child. Now, his mornings did not start with strong espresso and business news. They started with tears, tantrums, and struggling to put on tiny shoes. Stanislav was stressed. He kept checking his watch and counting the losses of being late to work. His anger passed to little Lena. She cried even louder, holding onto his perfectly ironed pants. At work, he was still a cold, tough leader. In meetings, his icy look made managers hold their breath. He gave orders and punished any mistakes. But when evening came, the man of granite felt a deep, quiet panic inside. He drove fast through city traffic, looking at his phone. He had to make it before the daycare closed. Walking in, he felt like a helpless schoolboy, not a rich businessman. At home, he faced silence, piles of dirty laundry, and total confusion. He did not know how to put his daughter to sleep or what to cook for her. That Friday, Stanislav was very late. A critical delivery was stuck at a construction site. When he finally ran to the daycare room, it was past 7 in the evening. Most kids were already home. The hallway was completely quiet. Stanislav opened the door a bit and stopped. In the corner, on a soft rug, sat a young caregiver named Lyuba. The evening sun made her blonde hair look golden. Lena was curled up happily in her lap. Lyuba was reading a fairy tale from a big book with bright pictures. Her voice was soft and musical. With her free hand, she gently rubbed the girl's back like a mother. Lena usually avoided strangers and cried a lot after her mother died. But now, she looked perfectly happy and calm. She looked up at Lyuba with a smile. There was so much real warmth in the room. Stanislav lost his breath for a moment. He realized he had not seen his daughter this peaceful in 6 months. Lyuba saw him, move back slightly, and gently put Lena on the rug. "Oh, Stanislav Igorevich, hello," she said quietly, trying not to ruin the moment. "We were just reading. Lenachka was great today. She ate all her soup. I'm sorry I'm late." "Lyubov," Stanislav cleared his throat. He brought back his professional voice, but he felt a strange, forgotten emotion inside. "I was stuck at work." While Lena picked up her toys, Stanislav decided to stay and ask a few questions. Soon, he learned about her life. Lyuba moved to the city 2 years ago. She lived alone, renting a small room far away. Her work with children was her whole life. She had no boyfriend and no wild parties. "What do you do in the evenings?" Stanislav asked, fixing his daughter's jacket. "Nothing special," Lyuba smiled shyly. "I go home to my room, cook a simple dinner, and read. Books are like good friends. You are never lonely with them." They said goodbye, but all the way home, while Lena slept in the back, Stanislav thought about Lyuba's words. He was a natural strategist. He was used to solving tough problems. Now, The pieces of the puzzle came together. There was a lonely, kind girl who loved his daughter. She could give Lena the warmth that he could not give. And she had no reason to stay in her empty room every night. A clear, detailed business plan started to form in Stanislav's head. He decided to make Lyuba an offer that no smart person would ever refuse. Chapter 2. A Business Proposition. On Monday evening, Stanislav did not wait for the daycare to close. He arrived half an hour early, waited until Lyuba's coworker relieved her, and approached her just as she was leaving the building. Lyuba, I have a serious matter to discuss with you. A business proposition. May I offer you a ride so we could discuss it in a quiet setting? His tone was polite, yet it brooked no argument. Lyuba was caught off guard, but she agreed. 15 minutes later, they were sitting in a quiet corner of a small, cozy cafe. Stanislav disliked long introductions. As soon as the waiter brought their tea, he got straight to the point. I will be completely frank with you, he began, looking her dead in the eye. Since the death of my wife, I've been on my own. I run a massive company, and my work hours are entirely unpredictable. It is incredibly difficult for me to balance this with raising my daughter, and Lena is the most precious thing in my life. I saw how attached she is to you, and I see how you treat her. Lyuba listened in silence, her hands tightly wrapping around her warm teacup. My plan is as follows, Stanislav said, opening a leather folder. I'm offering you a move into my home. You will have your own spacious, private room. You will not have to quit your main job at the daycare. However, in the evenings and on weekends, you will take over Lena's care, reading to her, taking her for walks, putting her to bed. In return, I will completely cover your living expenses and provide a monthly salary that is double your current income at the nursery. Here is the draft agreement. Every term is written down. Lyuba looked at the paperwork, stunned. For someone exhausting herself just to afford a modest rented room, this offer sounded like a lifeline. Yet at the same time, a flicker of fear stirred inside her. A stranger's house, a harsh, imposing man, and a massive responsibility. Stanislav Igorevich, this is so unexpected, she said softly. I don't know. I'm just an ordinary caregiver. In your home, my home operates in perfect order, Lyuba. I don't just need some outsider who doesn't care about my child. I need someone Lena trusts. Think about it. I won't rush you, but I need your answer tomorrow. Lyuba raised her eyes to look at Stanislav. Behind the rigid mask of a confident businessman, she suddenly caught a glimpse of a deeply exhausted, weary father who was just desperately trying to protect his little angel. And that was what decided everything. All right, Lyuba said quietly but firmly. I agree. We don't need to sign a contract. I take you at your word. I will do it for Lena. Chapter 3. Taming the House. 2 weeks had passed since Lyuba first crossed the threshold of Stanislav's home. For little Lena, this time had been a true blessing. The little girl had literally blossomed. She no longer cried at night and fell asleep easily to the quiet, lingering fairy tales Lyuba read to her under the soft glow of an old nightlight. Yet, the house itself remained cold and foreign. Lyuba kept a low profile, moving as quietly as a shadow. Stanislav barely saw her. He left early, returned late, dryly traded brief pleasantries, and locked himself away in his study. Every evening, the exact same black plastic containers awaited Lyuba and Lena on the kitchen table. Stanislav simply ordered ready-made meals from a nearby supermarket, dry cutlets, tasteless side dishes, and rubbery serniki. For Lyuba, who had grown up in a cozy provincial home where the kitchen was the beating heart of the family, this was painful to watch. A plastic lifestyle, flavorless food, and this eternal, ringing masculine coldness within the walls of a luxury apartment. On a particular Thursday, Lyuba had a day off from the daycare. After tucking Lena into bed for her afternoon nap, she walked into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator packed with soulless containers, and took a resolute breath. Pulling an old, worn cookbook with battered corners from her purse, a keepsake from her parents' house, Lyuba tied her hair into a bun and set to work. The evening turned out to be a nightmare. At one of the conglomerate's construction sites, the wiring had failed, subcontractors missed their deadlines, and Stanislav spent a grueling hour shouting during a conference call, his temples throbbing from the intense pressure. He drove into his underground parking garage dreaming of only one thing: to lock himself in his study with a glass of whiskey and be left entirely alone. He opened the heavy front door, automatically bracing for the usual sterile silence. But instead, right from the threshold, a rich, mouth-watering aroma enveloped him. It smelled of hearty meat broth, ripe tomatoes, garlic, dill, and fresh herbs. A real, proper, homemade borscht. Stanislav frowned. Stepping into the kitchen, he was met with an unexpected sight. Little Lena, sitting in a high chair and wearing a funny bib, was already eagerly devouring soup from a deep bowl, smudging her cheeks. And Lyuba, humming something under her breath, was gently wiping down the stove. The reflex of a manager, accustomed to everything running strictly according to an approved budget, kicked in instantly. Stanislav's face turned dry and rigid. Lyuba, his cold, steel voice rang out. Lyuba startled and turned around. I believe we clearly discussed the terms of our agreement. I pay for order and child care, not for impromptu kitchen experiments. We have delivery for meals. I do not need you wasting your time and my groceries on things we did not agree upon. A heavy silence descended upon the kitchen. Lyuba grew pale, her fingers tightening around the kitchen towel, but she did not look away. Her quiet brown eyes looked at him with a gentle reproach, showing no fear of the intimidating director. "Daddy, don't scold Labasha." Lena suddenly piped up, tapping her spoon against the table. "It's soup. It's yummy. Try it." Stanislav shifted his gaze to his daughter. The girl looked at him pleadingly. Without a word, Lyuba slid a clean bowl toward him, rich steam rising from it, and placed a spoon and a slice of fresh rye bread beside it. "Enjoy your dinner, Stanislav Igorevich," she said softly, took off her apron, and went into the nursery, leaving him alone with his daughter. With a sigh, Stanislav loosened his tie. His head was pounding, and his stomach rumbled betrayingly at the scent. He sat at the table, looked skeptically at the borscht, with a dollop of snow-white sour cream melting in the center, and reluctantly took a spoonful. And he froze. The flavor was incredible. Rich, deeply satisfying, with a subtle tang, exactly like the soup his mother used to cook for him in his distant childhood, long before he became a harsh businessman in an expensive suit. This taste seemed to pierce right through his stone armor, washing away the day's stress and irritation. Stanislav caught himself eating the borscht with the exact same enthusiasm as his 3-year-old daughter. Before he knew it, he had eaten every last drop. Later that night, when everyone in the apartment was asleep, Stanislav stood by the window in his dark study. He looked out at the city lights, but his mind was elsewhere. He recalled his sharp words to Lyuba in the kitchen, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt genuinely ashamed. She hadn't done it for money or praise. She had simply brought a piece of warmth into his freezing home. He listened closely to the atmosphere, the suffocating, graveyard silence that usually made him want to flee back to work was gone. The house was breathing. It smelled of comfort, peace, and home. Stanislav smiled faintly to himself, admitting defeat. Today, the boss's rigid iron rules had suffered a crushing defeat to a simple bowl of homemade borscht. And, weighing it all, he had to admit, Lyuba was right again. It was time to learn how to take off the executive mask, at least when crossing the threshold of his own home. Chapter 4. A lesson for the boss. With the arrival of homemade food, a fragile truce emerged in Stanislav and Lyuba's relationship, but true harmony was still a long way off. Accustomed to absolute obedience at work, Stanislav subconsciously brought the director-subordinate model into the walls of his apartment. If he was in a hurry, he might walk across the carpet in his outdoor shoes, leave a mug on the armrest of an expensive chair, or make a dry remark to Lyuba if something of his wasn't exactly where he expected it to be. Despite her gentleness and genuine love for little Lena, Lyuba possessed a strong inner core. She patiently smoothed over the rough edges, understanding the tragedy this man had gone through, but everything had its limits. That Tuesday, Stanislav returned home close to 11 in the evening. Groundwater issues had been discovered at the construction site of a new residential complex, and he had spent the entire day on his feet, coordinating engineers and endlessly arguing with designers. Fatigue locked his body, and his nerves were stretched like piano wires. He walked into the apartment without even bothering to lower his voice. He was still speaking loudly, in a raised tone, into his mobile phone, harshly reprimanding the chief engineer. "I said, redo it. I don't care about your excuses. Our deadlines are slipping. I want those new calculations on my desk by 8 tomorrow morning." His voice thundered through the quiet hallway. At that moment, the nursery door softly cracked open. Lyuba stepped out into the corridor. She wore a simple bathrobe, and her face looked pale and exhausted. She pressed a finger to her lips, urging him to be quiet, but Stanislav merely waved her off tentatively and continued yelling into the receiver. "That's all, get to work. Conversation over." He ended the call, tossed his keys onto the console table, and, breathing heavily, looked at Lyuba. "Stanislav Igorevich, please speak softly," she said regretfully, but firmly, looking directly into his eyes. "Lenachka barely fell asleep. She's teething. She cried all evening, and I just managed to rock her to sleep." Your voice echoes through the entire apartment. A dull irritation flared up inside Stanislav. All the stress accumulated throughout the day, the anger at his careless subordinates, and his wild exhaustion demanded an outlet. He squared his shoulders and looked down at Lyuba, switching on his usual boss persona. "Lyubov, I am in my own home," he declared in a cold, measured tone. "I am handling matters on which the survival of my company depends, and by extension, your salary. If I need to speak on the phone, I will speak on the phone. Your job is to ensure the child sleeps soundly, not to lecture me at the front door." Lyuba froze for a second. A shadow of deep hurt flashed across her eyes, but she did not shrink away or lower her gaze. Instead, she took a step forward, and a steel tone resonated in her quiet voice, something Stanislav never expected from her. "Stanislav Igorevich, you are not in your office here. You are not the CEO here, and these are not your terrified managers standing before you. Your daughter is sleeping right there. Please, learn to turn off the boss when you cross the threshold of this house. If you cannot respect my work, at least respect the peace of your own child." With those words, Lyuba turned and quietly, but resolutely, closed her bedroom door behind her. Stanislav was left standing in the empty corridor. His ego was bruised. A nanny had dared to tell him how to behave in his own home. He opened his mouth to call her back and tell her exactly what he thought, but the words caught in his throat. A ringing silence settled over the apartment. Stanislav walked into the living room, sat on the sofa, and buried his head in his hands. The anger began to slowly recede, leaving behind only a bitter aftertaste. Not a sound came from the nursery. Fortunately, Lena hadn't woken up. He remembered Lyuba's face in the dim light of the hallway. There was no malice in her eyes, no desire to sting. Only the exhaustion of someone who had fought children's tears all evening and a fierce protection of a little human being. Stanislav looked at his hands, then at her closed door. "Turn off the boss when you cross the threshold." He repeated her words in his mind. It took a great deal of courage for him to admit it. She was absolutely right again. He had acted like an egoist, hiding his own helplessness behind a commanding voice. A home is not built on executive orders, and the people here are not hired hands at a construction site. The next morning, Stanislav got up early. When Lyuba came out to the kitchen to prepare breakfast for Lena, he was already standing by the stove, shifting awkwardly from foot to foot next to the whistling kettle. Seeing her, He cleared his throat and, without looking her in the eye, said quietly, "Lyuba, I am sorry about last night. You were right. I lost my temper." Lyuba looked at him in surprise, and then her expression softened. A barely noticeable, warm smile appeared on her lips. The tension that had filled the house melted away. They had taken another step toward each other. Chapter 5. The Breaking Point. Following their morning reconciliation, a long-awaited balance settled over Stanislav's home. The apology had not come easily to him, but it had melted the ice. Lyuba began to feel more confident, and Stanislav caught himself rushing home from work with a light heart for the first time in 6 months. He started to notice the little things, how neatly his shirts were folded, how contagiously Lenachka laughed while talking about her day, and what a warm, unobtrusive atmosphere wrapped around the apartment. Yet, his habit of controlling everything and everyone, a subconscious distrust of people, and the fear of losing control over his life once again played a cruel trick on him. Something occurred that his rigid, pragmatic business mindset had failed to foresee. On Saturday, Stanislav had to go to the office for a few hours to sign contracts with new suppliers. Lyuba stayed behind with Lena. The day flew by unnoticed. They raced each other to brush their teeth, build a massive castle out of building blocks, and after lunch, Lyuba decided to prepare a surprise. She knew how deeply Lena missed her mother's baking, so she resolved to bake an apple strudel using that very same ancient recipe from her treasured book. Together they kneaded the dough, Lenachka enthusiastically scattering the apple pieces, laughing whenever flour accidentally dusted her nose. The apartment filled with the aroma of cinnamon and vanilla. Stanislav returned earlier than planned. The negotiations had gone brilliantly, and he was in an excellent mood. Stepping into the apartment, he found a picture-perfect scene. The kitchen was in pristine order, a beautiful pie was cooling on the table, and the peaceful snoring of a sleeping Lena drifted from the nursery. Stanislav walked into the living room to put down his documents, and his gaze fell upon the coffee table. Lyuba's open cookbook lay there, its pages yellowed with time. Right next to it stood her open purse, from which the edge of a worn passport and an old, battered envelope peeked out forlornly. At that exact moment, the suspicious executive awoke within Stanislav. The man of granite did not believe in pure charity. It suddenly struck him as strange that a strange girl would so genuinely, uncomplainingly give herself to his family. A cynical thought flashed through his mind. What if beneath this mask of a quiet nanny lies a calculated plan? What if she's just looking for profit, trying to secure a place in his luxury apartment? Driven by a sudden, foolish impulse, Stanislav stepped toward the table. He peeked into the open bag and picked up the envelope. Inside was an old savings book in Lyuba's name, showing a tiny, almost laughable balance, along with a few letters from her mother in the village. Stanislav Igorevich, a quiet, trembling voice called out from the doorway. Stanislav startled and turned around. Lyuba stood in the living room doorway, holding a clean plate for the pie. Her eyes were wide with shock and confusion, and her lips trembled. She stared at the envelope in his hands, and a look of deep, unbearable humiliation slowly ignited in her gaze. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Stanislav felt a sudden surge of heat rise to his throat. He felt disgusted with himself, but his pride and his habit of never justifying his actions forced him to slip on a cold, unbothered mask. He carelessly tossed the envelope back onto the table. "I was simply checking, Lyuba. In my line of work, security is paramount. I must know who is living in my house and who has access to my child. It's nothing personal." "Nothing personal?" Lyuba took a step back, as if she had been struck. The plate in her hands trembled, but she managed to hold on to it. You were rummaging through my belongings. Were you looking for dirt on me? Checking my bank account?" "Lyuba, don't overreact," Stanislav frowned, his chest tightening with shame. Yet he maintained his defensive posture. "I pay you a salary. I have every right to know whether you are hiding something or not. Money." Lyuba let out a bitter, quiet laugh, and large, silent tears began to roll down her cheeks. "You measure absolutely everything in money. Stanislav Igorevich. Do you honestly believe that because you bought my time, you bought my dignity as well? You built a massive conglomerate, but you still haven't learned that trust and sincerity are not traded on construction exchanges. She gently set the plate down on the chest of drawers, making sure the noise wouldn't wake Lena. I thought that beneath your stone mask, there was a weary father who just needed help. But you are nothing but a cold, paranoid husk of a man. I will not stay here for another single minute. Lyuba turned and walked into her room. 10 minutes later, she stepped out into the hallway with her small suitcase, the very same one she had arrived with 2 weeks ago. She did not scream. She made no scenes. Her face held the expression of a calm, irreversible decision. Stanislav stood in the middle of the corridor, rooted to the spot. His orderly, meticulously calculated world was crumbling before his eyes because of his own absurd mistake. Lyuba, wait. Where will you go? It's almost night. Leave the suitcase. We will talk tomorrow. For the first time, panicked, pleading undertones cut through his voice. Lyuba stopped at the door, gripped the handle, and turned around. There was no anger on her tear-stained face, only endless exhaustion and disappointment. Back to my rented room, Stanislav Igorevich. It is poor and it is cold, but my privacy is respected there. Goodbye. Give Lena. Tell her that Labasha just had to leave on business. Please, don't hurt the little girl. The door clicked shut quietly. Stanislav was left entirely alone. The empty apartment still smelled of cinnamon and apple strudel, but that aroma of domestic comfort now felt like a cruel mockery. He had made the greatest mistake of his life. He had shattered the fragile happiness that had only just begun to take root in his freezing home. Chapter 6. Realization and the Search. The first night after Lyuba's departure dragged Stanislav back into the very same nightmare from which it had all begun. Only this time, the nightmare felt twice as acute. The massive apartment, which just hours ago had smelled of ripe apples and cinnamon, turned cold instantly and plunged into a ringing, dead silence. The strudel on the kitchen table remained completely untouched. Stanislav couldn't even bring himself to cut a slice. At 3 a.m, a cry echoed from the nursery. Lena had woken up from the pain of teething and immediately began calling for her Labasha. Stanislav rushed to her side, tried to rock her, giving her water and reading her favorite book with the bright pictures, but it was all in vain. The little girl sensed her father's panic and helplessness. She pushed his hands away and wept inconsolably, demanding the soft, melodic voice she had grown to love with all her heart. Finally, exhausted from crying, Lena fell asleep only toward dawn, sobbing convulsively in her sleep. Stanislav sat on the edge of her bed, staring at his daughter's flushed little face, feeling like the most pathetic man on earth. His praised pragmatism, his toughness, and his ability to calculate risks 10 steps ahead had led to total failure. He had destroyed his own child's peace with his own hands, all because of an absurd, blind suspicion. The next morning, he did not go to work. Leaving all the matters at the construction site to his chief deputy, Stanislav began his search. As expected, Lyuba's phone was turned off. At the daycare, where he rushed for the opening, the director simply folded her hands dryly and flatly refused to give out her employee's home address, citing confidentiality. You are a wonderful sponsor, Stanislav Igorevich, but Labachka is a pure soul. If she left your house in tears, it means you hurt her deeply. I will not help you pressure her. The elderly woman cut him off. Then, Stanislav used his security channels. Within 2 hours, a document with the exact address of Lyuba's rented home arrived on his work tablet. It was an old 5-story building on the very outskirts of the city, in an industrial district. He parked his luxurious black SUV right by the broken steps of the shabby entrance. The contrast between his world and the reality in which Lyuba lived was immediately striking. A heavy iron door with a broken intercom, peeling paint on the walls, and the dim light of a single bulb on the landing. Stanislav climbed to the 4th floor and stopped before a wooden door covered in old vinyl leather. The heart of the CEO, which had never faltered before the toughest audits or tax inspectors, was now pounding wildly in his chest. He took a deep breath and knocked. Behind the door, quiet footsteps could be heard. "Who's there?" a familiar voice asked, slightly hoarse from crying. "Lyuba, it's Stanislav. Please, open up. I need to speak with you. Just 5 minutes." A long, agonizing silence fell behind the door. Stanislav feared she would simply walk away into the room, but then the lock clicked. The door slowly cracked open. Lyuba stood on the threshold in a simple sweater. She wore no makeup. Her eyes were swollen from lack of sleep, and a shadow of that same deep hurt still lingered in her gaze. But she didn't look afraid. Rather, she looked endlessly tired. "Why did you come, Stanislav Igorevich?" she asked softly, keeping the door chain on. "Did you find my address through your bloodhounds? Did you come to check if I stole something from you before leaving?" Every single word struck a direct blow to his wounded pride, but Stanislav didn't even flinch. He lowered his head and did something he had never done in his life before subordinates or partners. He admitted his absolute defeat. "Lyuba, Lena isn't sleeping. She cried all night and called for you. Without you, the house became dead, and I didn't come here as a director. I came as a fool who made a terrible mistake and wants to fix it. I'm sorry. Please, let's go home. For Lena's sake, and for mine." Lyuba looked closely into his face, searching for his usual cold mask or any sign of deceit. But standing before her was a deeply remorseful, exhausted man, with not a single trace left of his former arrogance. Chapter 7. A New Beginning. The tension hanging in the air of the communal apartment was thick enough to cut with a knife. Lyuba looked at Stanislav through the narrow crack of the door, keeping the safety chain firmly in place. Her face, completely free of makeup and with eyes reddened from crying, showed a deep exhaustion, yet at the same time, an unyielding resolve. "Stanislav Igorevich, everything has already been said." Lyuba's voice sounded muffled, but she did not raise it. "You cannot simply burst into my life whenever things become inconvenient for you and expect me to forget everything." Stanislav did something no one in the business world had ever seen him do. He lowered his gaze, slumped his shoulders, and pressed his palm against the cold, weathered doorframe. All of his usual stature and self-assurance had completely vanished. "I'm not asking you to forget, Lyuba," he said quietly, almost in a whisper. "I'm begging for a chance to fix everything. Not as your employer, but as a man who finally understands that everything he built, his career, his money, his cold spreadsheets, is not worth a single second of my daughter's genuine laughter. Lena doesn't understand why you left. And to be honest, I have also stopped understanding why I was so blind." Lyuba slowly lowered the chain. The click of the metal echoed in the quiet hallway like a gunshot. She swung the door wide open, revealing her tiny, empty room, where the only thing of any value was a worn-out suitcase sitting in the corner. "Did you truly come all this way just for me?" she asked, searching his eyes intently. "Not because you simply need a nanny? Not because the house is a mess?" "I don't need a nanny, Lyuba," Stanislav replied, lifting his gaze to her for the first time, his eyes filled with raw pain. "I need a soul in that house. I need you to teach me how to be a father again, rather than a director. Without schedules, without estimates, and without audits. Just you." Lyuba remained silent for a long time, looking at him. She saw how his hands trembled, how he struggled to find the right words. Deep inside her heart, which had been so badly wounded the night before, something softened. She saw in him the very same Stanislav who had apologized to the kettle on that early morning, a man who, despite his iron character, proved capable of genuine remorse. "All right," she finally said, and a single, solitary tear rolled down her cheek. "But we will return on my terms. No director behavior, no investigations, and no suspicions. We will learn to trust each other from the very beginning." Stanislav nodded, feeling the final bastion of his icy loneliness crumble within him. Epilogue. 3 months passed. Stanislav's apartment was no longer a cold, sterile office. In the living room, building blocks lay scattered right on the carpet. The kitchen smelled of homemade pies, and every evening, bright, ringing children's laughter echoed from the nursery. Stanislav now made sure to come home on time. His subordinates at work were astonished. Their iron boss had become calmer, more human, and sometimes he even allowed himself to smile. The moment he crossed the threshold of his home, he stopped being the CEO. Lyuba stayed, but no longer as a hired employee. She became the invisible thread that stitched Stanislav's broken world back into a single whole. There were no loud words or passionate confessions between them, only a quiet, profound attachment that grew stronger with each passing day. Stanislav often caught himself thinking that the most vital things in life cannot be bought with any amount of money. The most important thing is simply knowing that someone is waiting for you in the evening, and that behind the door of your home, a soft, warm light is always burning.